This is Edward Siegel. Welcome to the Crisis Ahead podcast. Each week, we look at how companies, organizations, and individuals in the news are responding to, managing, or recovering from a crisis, and what you can learn from their successes or failures. My observations and recommendations are based on my experience managing crisis situations and advising others on how to respond to and bounce back from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. My guest this week is Mike McCurry, a former White House press secretary and spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State. This veteran government spokesperson will talk about the best practices for individuals who represent their companies or organizations to the public during a crisis. But before Mike comes on, I want to say a word about messaging. When dealing with any crisis, it's always best to send a clear and consistent message about the crisis. That was not the case recently when the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention changed its mind, again, about what people should or should not do about the pandemic. Since there's no telling what the CDC may say or do next or why, I'm not going to get into the details here about their latest policy reversal. No matter when you hear this commentary, be sure to check with trusted health officials about the appropriate steps you should take to protect yourself against COVID-19. In college football, the Big Ten Conference decided in August to postpone its fall sports season, until it decided last week not to postpone the season. The Big Ten said that all 14 teams would play 8 regular season games. While the reversal of its original decision certainly made football players and fans happy, it was another example of an organization zigging and zagging in a crisis. What playbook does your organization have for dealing with the coronavirus crisis, or any crisis? I've written a new book that includes important advice about responding to, managing, and recovering from more than 100 different types of crisis situations. It also includes a generic template that you can use to prepare a crisis management plan for your company or organization. Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. Crisis Ahead is now available as a paperback book wherever books are sold and as an ebook from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Crisis Ahead is filled with case studies about how companies and public figures have prepared for and handled crisis situations, and the important lessons you can learn from their successes and failures. The book also includes checklists and exercises to help you get ready for and react to a crisis. You can learn more about the book at publicrelations.com. It's not too early to start preparing for the next crisis. That's because history shows there is always a next crisis, and the sooner you are ready for it, the better. Spokespersons are usually in the news because they are delivering information and updates about a crisis that involves their employers or clients. But Michael Caputo, a spokesperson for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, was in the news recently for a very different reason. According to CNN and other news outlets, Caputo went on Facebook to make some outrageous comments about the staff at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, former Vice President Joe Biden, and others. Caputo later apologized and took a leave of absence from the federal agency. But despite the apology, he told a radio station in Buffalo, New York that, quote, "I believe everything I said, and I will stand by it, and the president stands by what I said," unquote. Who should represent your organization in a crisis? What are some of the best practices for individuals to follow when they are the public face of your company? I'm glad to have on my show today someone who has extensive first-hand knowledge about what it takes to be a spokesperson. Mike McCurry spent 4 years as White House press secretary in the Clinton administration, and before that was the spokesperson for the U.S. State Department. He is now a distinguished professor of public theology at the Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Well, glad to be with you. I can honestly say that I have responded to crises and probably created a few on my own.
As a veteran spokesperson yourself, what do you think about HHS spokesperson Michael Caputo and what he had to say?
Well, I mean, I mean, that's a very sad episode. And, it's reflective of the kind of people that you do not want to have managing crises in an administration. And you need to, try to get people who will, change the vocabulary and change the vernacular and adopt a new attitude in how you deal with crisis when it develops.
Tell us something about the road you took that led you to become the spokesperson for the State Department and the White House.
I had worked a long time. I was a journeyman press secretary in the Democratic Party and had worked for a long time. I had the misfortune in 1992, actually not the misfortune, but I worked for Bob Kerrey when he ran against Bill Clinton. So I thought there was probably no chance that I was going to get any job in the Clinton administration. But my friend George Stephanopoulos stepped in and said, Mike's been around a long time and we should have him involved in the administration. So that's how I ended up at the State Department. And I did a well enough job there that I got noticed by the Clintons, and then they invited me to come over to the White House. But, in terms of this subject, I really recall what it was like responding when the Murrow building in Oklahoma City was blown up, and how you respond in a crisis like that. Because one of the things that happened immediately was the media jumped to all kinds of conclusions, and they were speculating that we were searching for Arab-connected suspects and stuff like that, which obviously ended up with Timothy McVeigh not being accurate, and slowing people down in the midst of a crisis so that, say, let's just not get hyperventilated. Let's think about how we get the facts correct and then report what we really know to be true and get the story straight. I mean, that's a very, very hard thing to do. It's hard to de-accelerate the momentum of the pressure that you get from the media now, particularly social media, and which is not something I had to deal with in the 1990s. But it's just like everything moves at such a throbbing pace, and sometimes getting the facts together and getting the truth so you can present it, it takes a little bit of time. And one of my constant admonitions to the press is give us a little time to make sure that we get the factual information correct. It's a hard thing to do.
Is that easier said than done?
It is very, very hard to do. And to try to convince people that they should just wait until we get all the information that we need to give to you to make it straight is hard to do. I referenced the blowing up of the federal building in Oklahoma City. In the aftermath of that, there were like reports constantly that we were looking for Arab-connected suspects. And I called the Attorney General and said, that CNN's reporting that we've got a lockdown on, various ports of entry to the United States, and we're looking for Arab suspects. And she said, that's just not true. we are not doing that. And to try to convince people that they needed to slow down and wait until we had factual information that was worth considering, that was a hard thing to do. I think that's, for your purposes, that's the hardest thing to do in a crisis is to assemble your facts and get them together and to, relay confidence to people that you will get the story straight. But it just takes a little bit of time sometimes to get the story straight, because it's like, there's no truth closet at the White House where you just open it up and everything tumbles out. I mean, it's like, it takes work to get all of the factual information together. And I think developing some kind of discipline where you actually have a process by which you get your information together, but reassure people that when we get the information together, we will tell the truth. and we'll tell the truth as we know it. I mean, I think that's a very, very hard thing to do, but that is the core of, I think, dealing with a crisis.
What do you think are some of the most important qualifications or characteristics that someone should have before they become a spokesperson for a company that's going through a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think, um, skepticism would be at the top of my list. I mean, don't believe everything that you get told by every, general manager who's trying to cover their ass. I mean, it's like that's an important thing. So being able to probe. I used to like to say the great thing about being White House press secretary was you were a reporter in the White House with unlimited access to all of your sources. So I could kind of go and sort of say, what's the deal here? I could go into Bill Clinton and sort of say, here's the guidance that we have today for this subject. And he would look at it and he would say, well, that's just bullshit. And I said, well, that's your policy. So do you want to change it? And he would pick up the phone and call someone and make something happen. So the accountability of being in front of the press and being held accountable actually produces better results for the performance of the organization, whether it's the White House, the U.S. government, or probably any major corporation.
If there was a spokesperson Hall of Fame, who would you nominate to be in it and why?
I mean, there are a number of standards for that. Marlin Fitzwater is one of my favorites. I mean, he's the only White House press secretary that worked for two different presidents. So he is really good. Jim Haggerty is considered kind of the gold standard, and he was Eisenhower's press secretary and really kind of developed what is the now modern model for how you do press interactions. And Eisenhower's, a lot have been in the news about him over the last couple of days with the opening of his memorial. And I need to go down there and say, I hope there's some tribute to Haggerty at that place. Jim Haggerty was the press secretary to President Dwight Eisenhower, and for many ways was kind of set the gold standard of what White House press secretaries should be, because he was, he knew intimately everything that Ike knew and went out and did his briefing every day. Now, this was before we had televised briefings and things like that. So, but he had a good rapport with the press corps, and they trusted him. And he had the trust of the president, and the president would, sort of said, there's a great transcript of a press conference that Eisenhower had once, and he said, I don't know the answer to that. Jim, come over here and answer the question. So can you imagine a presidential press conference where, the president sort of says, I don't know, get Jim over here to answer the question. I mean, like, that would not happen today, but it was, a reflection of the way in which people had some confidence and faith in what, he was doing. And he kind of set a model that I think a lot of former or future White House press secretaries tried to match. But I think the people who have done well in this job are people who are skeptical enough to not trust everything that they hear. Jody Powell, by the way, another person who I kind of modeled my career on. And they were, familiar enough with the president that they would know the president's inside thinking, but they also had kind of external antenna that sort of made them cautious and aware of how people would try to, BS the White House and the president. And you had to kind of dig deep sometimes to get the accurate information. And that, that is the role that an effective spokesperson plays, is to really probe and really challenge people who are otherwise trying to put out kind of a gilded lily version of whatever they want the story to be.
Why was Jody Powell, who is President Carter's press secretary, a role model for you?
Well, because he had this effective manner, he would stand at the podium. These were in old days. Jody was a, you know, he was a smoker, which I think kind of maybe was part of the reason for his demise. But he'd sit up at the podium and smoking his cigarette and answering questions. And the reporters in those days, they didn't have the kind of the seating that they have now. They were all in sofas down below. And so he would sort of entertain them and kind of keep them engaged. And I remember that's the first time I ever went to the White House, and first time I ever saw a White House briefing was watching Jody doing one of his briefings. And I said, like, that is the coolest job on the face of the earth. And, but the reason he was so successful was that he was in a total mind meld with Jimmy Carter. I mean, everyone knew he knew exactly what Carter was thinking because he was such a trusted advisor to Carter. And there was no question about, where's your information coming from? Because every reporter in the room knew he was speaking authentically and directly for whatever the president wanted to have said. So, and that was, a very important distinction.
Is there anyone you see today that impresses you and you think should be considered a role model for the new generation of spokespersons?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of friends who work in the business and do terrific work. I was just on a conference call, not singling her out, but Karen Hughes is someone who I am very highly admiring of. We just happened to be on a call yesterday on another subject, but I'm thinking of her. Karen Hughes was the longtime press aide to President George W. Bush, and has been very involved in working with him on his center down in Texas, and has been working on a lot of other stuff, and is just a good example of, and our collaboration on things has been a good example of how you work across partisan divides to make good things happen. I'm thinking there are a lot of people who they know that they have to represent the truth when they are in the public square, but they also know they have to represent the interests of whatever organization or corporation that they're serving. And balancing that equation is really, really hard sometimes because you want to maintain your credibility. You want to be seen as a trusted communicator on behalf of whoever you're serving. And that requires, maintaining some level of trust with the media and with reporters and with other people. But it also means that you have to kind of maintain trust within the inner circle suite of people that you serve. And I think that's a delicate balance, and getting it right is a pretty challenging professional obligation.
Today, of course, many companies are facing not one, but several crisis situations because of the pandemic. Is there a secret for managing and communicating about multiple crisis situations at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, you've got multiple crises, and you've got, I think a lot of corporations have got, they're looking at stock price, they're looking at other external issues that they're dealing with. But I think having a consistent message that is embraced by everybody and that is set from the top, I think it's very, very critical that you've got engaged senior management, including the chief executive or president of the corporation, involved in sort of saying, here's what we need to be saying, and then promulgating that message across the whole, organization so that everybody understands, here's our message, here's what we're saying, here's what we're doing, and there's no ambivalence about that. Sometimes I think a lot of chief executives try to hide behind other PR people in the corporation, and there's no substitute for direct leadership from the top. And I think that's what is required, and particularly in dealing with a crisis. You need to know, what do we know? What don't we know? how can we explain to people the timetable in which we will try to present the information that we do have. And I think helping people understand we don't have all the information instantly at once. And so give us the time. We promise that we will get the truth out, but give us the time to make sure that the truth that we are able to get out is accurate. And, getting people to slow it down a little bit and not have, the instantaneous desire for, whatever is breaking news, trying to get people to understand that it's not easy sometimes for large organizations to get everything accurate and get it immediately. That's a learning, and it's something I hope communications professionals in the corporate world help their senior management learn that discipline.
How important is it for CEOs, presidents, or other top officials to be the face of their companies in a crisis?
I think it's now it's pretty obvious that if something bad happens in a corporation, they want the top person to take responsibility. I mean, I don't think you can put a lot of PR people out or put your, corporate public affairs vice president out. But at the end of the day, they want to hear from the person who's ultimately going to be responsible. And I think a good CEO or a good president of a corporation will say, look, this is going to be on me. And so I need to be prepared and need to go out and be able to do it. Now, you need to do it under correct discipline. You're not just going to go out and do press conferences every hour on the hour, but you need to be the face of the person for the organization that you represent. And I think when that has not happened, you see the results. When people they don't feel like there's anyone accountable because they don't see the face of the person who's like the head of the corporation. There's a price that gets paid for that.
Tell us about your role at the Wesley Theological Seminary.
Well, totally different from what we've been talking about. But I became interested in this question of how do politics and religion intersect? And, what are the influences that we see on our political system from people of faith? So I got engaged through my local Methodist congregation, which is right across the street from us here, and then got involved at Wesley Theological Seminary. And I teach and direct a program now that is really very much about the question of how do people of faith get engaged and work in the area of public policy and politics, and what should their role be? There's kind of a unwritten rule that politics and religion don't mix. And so I take the exact opposite view, as which they do mix and need to mix. And so we've developed some programming and working to do a lot in that area.
Where can people go to learn more about the seminary?
They could go on wesleyseminary.edu. And that's where we've got a lot of stuff about our Center for Public Theology, which is a lot there on that. I have to confess, I'm not like that. I'm not active that much on websites and social media myself, just because I've got too many baseball games to watch. But wesleyseminary.edu is a great location to kind of go and see some of the stuff that we're doing. And then if you're there on that site, you can go to information about the Center for Public Theology, which is the organization that I help direct there.
My guest this week has been Mike McCurry, former spokesperson for the U.S. State Department and White House press secretary in the Clinton administration. Thanks for being on the show, Mike.
Oh, it's great to be here, and keep up the good work.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Crisis Ahead podcast. Remember, it's not a matter of if companies and organizations will have a crisis, but when.